My name is Kathy Hoffman. I am a Master Food Volunteer with K-State Extension here in Johnson County. And today we are going to talk about making pie dough. And not just pie dough, but flaky and tender pie dough. Here are the ingredients, so simple, just 5 ingredients. Flour, sugar, salt, fat, and cold water. First, we'll start with the flour. This is all-purpose flour, no need for anything special. And this is 3 cups of all-purpose flour. I did not measure it, I weighed it. And I highly recommend weighing your flour for more accurate results, which will give you more consistent results. So to the flour, I'm going to add a tablespoon of sugar, a teaspoon of kosher salt, and I just want to say you can substitute table salt, that's perfectly fine, but there's a different measurement ratio. If this is a teaspoon of kosher, it has large granules. If you use table salt, 1/2 teaspoon. And we're going to whisk that together. And now we're ready for the star of the show, and that is the fat. Make sure you keep your fat well chilled until you're ready to use it. This is a stick and a half of unsalted butter, and this is 1/3 cup of vegetable shortening. Both have to be chilled. You want to keep the fats chilled because once this dough hits the hot oven, it will then begin to melt. You don't want things to get soft ahead of time. So I'm going to, with a pastry blender, I'm going to cut the shortening in a little bit to get things started. And now I'm going to add the butter. And what I'm going to do is cut this in. First, I'm kind of getting the diced butter covered in flour, but I'm aiming for a pea-size piece of butter throughout the dough. And the butter's very cold, so I'm really using my muscles here. Every once in a while, you're going to have to clean it off. I'm using butter mainly because of the flavor, and that's why I call it the star of the show. Plus, I like the fact that it is a natural ingredient, but it does have a low melting temperature, so that's another reason why you want to keep it cold. Just about have it. Okay, let's look at it. Okay, as you can see, this is pea-sized butter chunks. It's looking good. Find a big one there, just tear it in half. I'm using a little bit of vegetable shortening with the butter because vegetable shortening is a little easier to handle, and it will help in the crimping of the dough later so that when it hits the oven, it will be less likely to lose its shape. If it were all butter, it tends to probably melt a little bit quicker, so the crimp might slump a little bit. Next, we're going to add the ice water. For me, this is the most difficult part because you have to be able to recognize when you've added enough water. And generally with this recipe, a half a cup of ice water will do the trick, but I always have extra ice water on hand in case I feel like it's not quite going to come together. Also, I like to use a fork. A regular fork is fine, but I like the action of fluffing it rather than a stir. It's so important with pie dough to manipulate the dough as little as possible, and that's super important at this step because once we add water, the gluten starts to form. We don't want a lot of gluten. Like if you were making bread, homemade bread, you work the dough to strengthen and build the gluten. In pastry, that's at the other end of the spectrum, you want to manipulate it ever so gently. So, for the most part, you're just going to add a little at a time and fluff it in there. You'll see these lumps getting a little bigger as the mixture comes together. And I see big particles, so I kind of just slash them in half. A little more around the bowl. Now that's a half cup, and we'll see how it goes. So this is the critical point. We have to decide if we've added enough water. So take your dough and squeeze it. I think that's a little dry. It probably won't take much, but we're going to go slow at this point to make that decision. Probably added maybe a tablespoon or so. And it's looking better. And I'm cutting it because I want the dry flour that's left to get incorporated. Okay, let's test it again. Much better. Maybe a half a teaspoon or so. Okay, I like the look of that. So now what I'm going to do is divide the dough in half, top crust, bottom crust, and make 2 dough discs. And what I have on my counter are 2 pieces of plastic wrap, and I'll show you how I do that. I pretty much eyeball it. Take a giant handful at a time. Here, a little there. Okay, this is, I'm pretty sure is going to be about right. Now, again, because we're working with butter and we all have fairly warm hands, I've laid the plastic wrap down to help me shape this into a disc using the plastic wrap. And then it's ready to wrap. I turn it over And you want a round disc just because it'll be easier to roll in a circle once it's ready. Okay, that's one. This one might be a little bigger. That's okay. We'll use the bigger one for the bottom crust because you'll need a little more for the bottom because it comes up the sides. Alrighty, there's my 2 dough discs. At this point, we're going to let this rest and refrigerate, chill it for an hour. I want you to notice that when you make the disc, you will see pieces of butter. And that's a good thing because again, once this dough hits the oven, the water in the butter and the water that you've added will create steam, leave an air pocket, and create flake. So now we're back and my dough is well chilled. And you know, also besides chilling the dough and getting the fats solid again, you also want that dough disc to continue to hydrate. And that's what the time is all about. Leave it in for an hour. Now I have it ready, bench flour. And the first thing I'm going to do is toss that around. And when you start out, you're going to use more flour than later. See, look how much flour that picked up. Okay? And it is a little chill. You might want to set it out maybe for 10 minutes before you begin. And I also want to coat my rolling pin in flour. Okay, let's see. That looks good. Now see how much it picked up there? The important thing about rolling is you want to continue to move the dough. So especially at the beginning, roll it, move it. Maybe put more flour on your pin. Oops. And have that ready, a bench scraper, in case you do have a little sticking, you can do that. It's moving right along. What happens if you don't coat your rolling pin, the rolling pin will pick up on that fat and it'll get on and make it stick. And go out from the center to create your circle. I'm going to make about a 12-inch circle, maybe 13. Okay, still movable, that is good. I want to point that out, the moving, because I've taught many pie classes, hands-on pie classes, and I would say that's the #1 mistake students make when they're new at this. They don't make sure that it can slide and it sticks. Sometimes it sticks pretty bad. Okay, it's looking pretty good. Alrighty. And you'll notice it's pretty even, but I always feel it. Because if it's thicker here, you definitely want to get it thin. And you don't want your dough too thick. This recipe is a generous recipe. So you will have enough dough. And this dough is rolled out to maybe an 1/8 inch, 1/8 to a 1/4. And again, we can see that butter sitting there. That's a very pretty sight. So now let's make sure it's big enough. And I believe this is a 12 or 13 inch disc. This pie plate is a 9.5 inch. They call it deep dish, which most pie plates are these days. And this is readily available anywhere. I'm going to set the pie plate in front of me. And to transfer the dough to the pie plate, I believe the easiest way is to wrap the dough partially around the rolling pin and carry it to the pie plate. So here we go. I'm going to partially roll it, move the pie plate in, and this is where you have to eyeball it and make sure you have enough overhang. I'm lifting, and that looks good. I'm going to adjust it a little bit. And here is also an important step. You're going to want to ease it in ever so gently. We don't want to stretch the pie dough because it tends to spring back. So just ease it. That looks good. And we have plenty of overhang. Okay, now that we have our dough in the bottom, the pie plate is ready to be filled. And I have probably we're making an apple pie. I probably have about 4 pounds of apples here that I've sliced. I have Granny Smith and Gala. It's a nice mixture. Ease the apples in. You don't want to tear any dough. If you tear the bottom dough at this point, what's going to happen is the juices will slide under the dough and your pie will stick to the pan. Get all the juices, and I'm just going to gently work it around a little bit just so it's kind of even. You can use any mixture of apples you want. I like the tartness of the Granny Smith with some other kind of red apple, as long as the apple is firm and bakeable and doesn't turn to mush, any apple will do. All right, now I'm finishing rolling the top crust for our apple pie. Okay, got the second disc rolled out, and we're going to transfer that onto the top of your pie dough. So again, we're going to roll the dough partially around, kind of one turn. Eyeball it, watch where you're dropping it. That looks good. All right, so we've got extra dough hanging over, so our next step is to cut that dough. And by feel, I'm going to cut so that the dough is within an inch of the pie plate. And you know what? My dough is getting soft. And if that happens to you, just stick it in the refrigerator for a few minutes. And it'll be way easier to handle. I'm not really being precise. And when you start out, it's so much better to cut a little rather than a lot, or cut too much, I should say. Not that you can't just plop it back on if you don't have enough dough. All right, and the next step is crimping the dough. So what we're going to do, we have 2 pieces of dough, we're going to fold it under and press it to the pie plate. Again, don't pull it out. Don't stretch your dough in any way. I guess I do more of a rolling under. Press. Roll and press, roll and press. Okay, so I have that rolled and pressed all the way around, and now I'm actually going to do the crimping. And that is something I do with an index finger in one hand and pinchers on the other, like that. All around the pie dough. And if you could have your crimp on top of that little ledge, it makes for a more stable crimp, a prettier crimp, and it will do the job it's supposed to do, and that is keep the juices inside. You might want to stick your hands in dough so they don't stick. Okay, and then I go around one more time. This is so pretty, but I kind of like to point, make it a little more pointed because you'll lose some of that crimp once it hits the oven. The sharpness of it. So now it's important, now that we've got our dough crimped and sealed and so forth, is to make some vents. And you can take your knife and just slash it in places. I'm going to give you what I always do, and it's a bit of a design, so hang in there. It's kind of like making Christmas tree branches. And it doesn't have to be even. I turn it and do it kind of starting towards the middle. And I make it really a little uneven just for fun. If you make a pie too perfect, people will not know it's homemade. And they will assume you've picked it up somewhere. Okay, and one more section. And there we have it. Okay. And now the final step. And that is an egg wash. The purpose of the egg wash, this is 1 egg with a couple tablespoons of water scrambled up. I've got it really a little too loose. But the purpose of this, we're going to brush it on the top, is to create a shiny, beautifully browned crust. Okay, and then what I like to do is take what's called sanding sugar. It's a large granules, kind of a sparkly sugar, and I like to sprinkle that over the top. It will give it a little sparkle and a little crunch. And of course it does sweeten the dough just a tiny bit. All right, it's ready for the oven. This is going to bake in a 400-degree oven for about 50 minutes. And you want to put it on the very bottom shelf. We don't want a soggy pie crust. We want that bottom of the pie to be close to the element, the heating element in the oven. And how do we know it's done? You want to check it and watch for a little bubbling of the filling. And that's when it's done. Okay, 50 minutes, and you'll have a fabulous, tender, flaky apple pie.